Hello Year 12 and welcome to a video on the problem of evil. So this is going to be encompassing the whole unit, including the evidential, the logical, natural, moral, Augustine's Theodicy and Hick's Theodicy. Okay, so I'm going to try and get through this fairly quickly. So the problem of evil then. So this is the idea. If God was omnibenevolent, he would not want to see evil and suffering. If God was omnipotent, he'd be able to stop evil and suffering. Therefore, the fact that evil and suffering exists means God is not omnipotent. The issue of this is that this is not the Christian understanding of God. This isn't the God that Christians would recognize. Another solution might be God doesn't exist, or maybe that God doesn't love you. But this is a problem because the entire Christian religion is built around the idea that God does love us. So it's a problem for religious believers. And responses to these problems are known as theodicies. So these are attempts at demonstrating a rationale for how or why evil and suffering could exist at the same time as an omnibenevolent, omnipotent God. Okay, or to explain how evil and suffering is actually a part of God's omnibenevolence. So this is known as the inconsistent triads, and this is an a priori problem put forward by J.L. Mackie. So we can have any two of these statements, but we can't have all three. God might be omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but then evil shouldn't exist because he should be powerful and loving enough to stop it. So maybe evil exists and God is all loving, but he's not powerful enough to stop it. Or maybe evil exists, God is all powerful, but he's not loving enough to want to stop it. So it's an a priori problem because it is, based on the definitions of the terms. It has nothing to do with experience. So which one do we get rid of? So theodicies will be attempts at saying that we don't have to get rid of any of them. So this is the problem. So logical consistency between the aspects of God's personality and the existence of evil is called an inconsistent triad. It's called this because the triad means three, and there are three aspects that are inconsistent with one another. These are the three aspects. For many atheists, the theist cannot claim all three propositions as truth at the same time. One of them's got to go. So we have then attempts at solving it, theodicies, and one is by Augustine and one is by Hick. So quick summary, Augustine's Theodicy says God must allow evil as a part of his love, and this is because God must allow for the possibility of evil through free will. So God created us as free individuals. This means that God didn't create evil. He only created the possibility of evil, and we freely chose to bring that possibility into actuality. Hick takes a slightly different approach and says suffering and evil isn't actually bad. Rather, it helps us to grow, and so it's part of God's loving plan. So this is known then, the Mackie inconsistent triad is known as the logical problem of evil. It's a deductive a priori argument. Now we have the evidential problem of evil then. So this is by William Rowe. And this is an a posteriori problem. So the claim is that the existence of evil and suffering doesn't logically and deductively prove that God doesn't exist. It does, however, present an overwhelming amount of evidence that would suggest that he probably doesn't. So one is saying that it doesn't make logical sense, and one is saying that it doesn't make evidential sense. And it's up to you to decide which one's stronger. I mean, this really is an a priori versus a posteriori debate. So this goes all the way back to Plato and to Aristotle. Which form of argument is better? So the a priori has the advantage of being deductive and watertight, and it has to be true. All black cats have to be black, or they wouldn't be black cats. But the disadvantage of it may be not telling us anything. It's just telling us about the definition of terms. The a posteriori form, so the evidential problem of evil, has the advantage of providing new information. So look, the Indonesian earthquake in 2018 or tsunami in 2018, this is overwhelming evidence, but it doesn't have the strength of logical proof. So the evidential problem of evil is an inductive a posteriori argument put forward by William Rowe. Next, we have distinctions. Natural suffering is suffering that comes from the natural worlds, and moral suffering is suffering caused by humans through our free choices, such as war and crime. So we have some examples here, and you can pause these and go through them if you wish to. So the question is, which one is God more responsible for? Well, most people would say natural, because God made the natural worlds and we make our own moral decisions. But it's actually not that clear. You could argue that humans are responsible for natural evil because of global warming, or because of the original sin. The original sin brought natural suffering. Remember, the Garden of Eden was perfect before the original sin. Obviously, very easy to say that we are responsible for moral evil because it's our choices. Could say God's responsible for natural evil as well because God made the world. But we could also argue God's responsible for moral evil because God made us. So feel free to pause this and go through it in your own time if you wish to. So we're looking at Theodicy's then, defenses of God in trying to explain the existence of evil and suffering. The first Theodicy we're going to look at is Augustine's. So let's get some context. We already know about Augustine from the DCT unit. So he was writing at a time of real peril. So the Roman world was collapsing. So the early Christian community was very concerned with the problem of evil. The ancient world was collapsing. The world of the Roman Empire was falling apart. And also the fathers of the early church, including Augustine, grew up in a highly pluralist world. So this is a world where there are many competing ideas. For example, Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, Manichaeanism. Now, the ancient Greek belief system deals pretty well with the problem of evil. According to the ancient Greeks, evil exists because God isn't omnibenevolent. Instead, we have many gods, a plurality of gods, a polytheism. So Christianity has a problem because Christianity says that God is one, and he's all loving, and he's all powerful. And how is this possible in a collapsing, evil world? So Augustine is one of the most important Christian thinkers to have influenced European Christian thought. He lived between 345 and 430 AD. And Augustine was reacting against the Manichaean understanding of evil and suffering. So originally, Augustine was a Manichae. So Manichaeanism really owes its origins to Zoroastrianism, which is a form of Persian belief system, which believes that good and evil are in a battle, and good and evil are equally weighted. So Manichaeans were Christians who believed that the existence of evil and suffering was the result of the ongoing battle between two dualistic, cosmically opposed forces, good and evil. But this isn't going to make sense for a Christian, though, because God is all good, and also God is all powerful. So he cannot be, he cannot have a rival. God could destroy evil. So Manichaeanism isn't going to fit. It cannot be a battle. The Christian understanding is that God is all good, and also that he therefore makes the best possible world. So how can the best possible world be the world that we see around us? Augustine asks. Well, this is known as the principle of plenitude. The best possible world involves many, many choices. God, in his infinite love and his infinite wisdom, has created a world with plenty of choices. So this is known as a principle of plenitude. So the idea here is that God has given the choice to do many different things, both good and evil. God also wants us to freely love him, and the only way we can freely love him is by being free. And being free means the possibility of choosing what God doesn't want. So the angels, according to Augustine, were created first, and they were given grace, God's love. Some angels chose to rebel against God. So this was sort of the original act of original sin. So this is Augustine's argument then. Evil doesn't really exist as something that a good God has created. God hasn't created evil. Evil is simply the absence of good, and the possibility of the absence of good must exist in order for there to be free will. There can't be freedom if there isn't the possibility of things having an opposite that's a reality. So this is the idea that, you know, darkness doesn't really exist. Darkness is just the absence of light. Or maybe poverty doesn't really exist, it's just the absence of money. Or maybe sickness doesn't really exist, it's just the absence of health. And Augustine will say evil doesn't really exist, it's just the absence of good. And he has to allow for the absence of good in order for us to freely choose the good. So the idea is God did not create evil, he created the possibility of evil, and that makes him not bad. That makes him good still. And that's so we have freedom. So God created humans with the possibility of a free choice. The principle of plenitude means that God has made a world full of choice and full of options. He wouldn't be a loving God if he didn't do this. But there can be no free choice unless there is the choice to choose and really choose the opposite of something. So evil isn't really a thing, and that's how it escapes the inconsistent triad. Evil actually doesn't exist. Evil is just the name we give to the possibility to go against God. Now, an atheist would criticize this. He might say, if God was all loving, wouldn't he just create a world where there was no possibility of evil? In other words, a world without the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. And a theist would reply by saying that this actually isn't omnibenevolent. It's not omnibenevolent to create a world with no freedom. God wants us to be benevolent. He wants us to be good. That's what love means. And the only way we can be good is if we choose to be good, and the only way we can choose to be good is if we have the possibility to choose to be evil. So it is not just good to be good, it's good to choose to be good. And we could disagree and say, couldn't God stop people just before they're about to perform evil? Couldn't he kill Hitler just before he instigated the Holocaust? Couldn't God stop Eve just before she was going to eat the apple? Why must God let us carry out the evil act and suffer the consequences? And the idea here is that it's not really a free choice unless you understand the consequences and you are able to live the consequences. If God stops you just before you do it, then you're not really free. So an omnibenevolent God can't interfere. There must be the consequences of a bad action in order for it to be freely chosen. And you can't freely choose to cheat unless you freely know the outcome of both options. That's the argument. And we have criticisms here. So tell the person who suffered under Hitler's Holocaust that evil doesn't really exist. It feels real, right? Counter-argument to that might be maybe the Holocaust wasn't something that really is God's creation. Instead, it's the absence of God's love. Another criticism, why is evil the absence of good? Couldn't we call good the absence of evil? The counter to this might be Augustine is influenced by Plato and Plotinus. Plato believed that the world was essentially a poor mimicry or reflection of the form of the good. So this is the idea that the true reality is the good. And everything that doesn't reflect the good is evil, or is to some degree evil. So good is the ultimate reality. Think of the form of the good. So our world is a world defined by lack of adequate reflection of the form of the good. So good is the ultimate reality, and evil is falling away from that. Another criticism, God has created evil because God has created everything. So we might say Augustine doesn't escape the inconsistent triad because God created the possibility of evil and therefore he created it. Disagree, you could say God hasn't created evil, he's created free will. There was no evil in God's original creation in the Garden of Eden. Instead, there was choice, and we introduced evil. Augustine has a deep problem when it comes to free will because he believes it is so corrupted by sin that free choice is no longer a reality. So how can he have a theodicy built around free choice when he also believes that our free choice has been corrupted by sin? counter could be God still loves us because God has created Christ, so he's created a way back. Criticism, if God was omnipotent, could he not have made a better world, a world where we have free will, but there isn't quite as much evil? Counter, we might use Leibniz, a philosopher who says that God has created the best of all possible worlds. Before God made the world, he surveyed all possible worlds and realized that this was the best. It's the best because it allows for God's purposes. So God has purposes that are beyond our understanding. If God is omnipotent, surely he is in charge of logic. So why is it that he must make the possibility of evil in order to allow for freedom? This is a tricky criticism. If God is omnipotent, he could have made a world where there was freedom and no evil. Counter to this is, well, can God control logic? Can God make 2 + 2 = 67? Can God make the shortest person taller than the tallest person? Can God make free will without evil? And this really depends on your definition of God. Is God in control of logic, or is logic in control of God? Okay, so Augustine describes then evil as just the privation of good, the absence of good. He calls this the privatio boni. This means a lack of good. So evil is necessary. God has not created it. It's simply the absence of goodness. And it must be there for freedom to be a possibility. So God didn't create evil, therefore he's not responsible for it. AO2, again, we could say Augustine says that God had to allow the possibility of evil, but we might say he's omnipotent, so surely he's able to create a world without it. But that's to do again with your understanding of God and whether he's in control of logic. Okay, so how does Augustine's theodicy account for natural evil then? We can explain moral evil because it's freedom. But what about natural evil, like earthquakes and tsunamis? Well, the answer here is there was no natural evil before the fall. We introduced the metaphysical fall, which is the world changing. The world changing. And we might say this isn't a good explanation, because to solve the inconsistent triad, Augustine needs to argue that God made just enough evil for his purposes. Now, surely moral evil would be enough to allow for freedom. Was it necessary to create natural evil? Was it necessary to create suffering that animals go through, just so that we can have free will? Maybe there's too much evil. So this is a paragraph I've written. Feel free to pause it and read through it if you wish to. Okay, so this is the idea that it's better to choose to be good than to be programmed to be good. So free will is so important. We're made in God's image, so free will is essential. It's essential because in order to be like God, we have to use freedom and reason. So Augustine, evil is not a positive phenomenon that actually exists. It is simply the absence of good. We might say, wouldn't it still be more loving to create an Eden with no possibility of sin? But the response to that is there had to be free will. Similarly, a good God must also punish for sins that are committed. So there must be justice. And therefore, when we're similarly present in sin, there must be punishment for that. So when Adam and Eve were given the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in order to allow for them to freely continue to live in a world that was good. And they disobeyed it, and we're being punished for that. Okay, so drawing on Plato's Timaeus, Augustine asks himself, wouldn't it be better if God had created a world without the possibility of freedom to sin? But he says, no, actually, a world with variety is actually a better world, a more loving world. And we've looked at this already. This is known as the principle of plenitudes. So natural and moral evil come from Adam and Eve's disobedience, and it's passed on through sex. Now, animals and their suffering is a problem for Augustine, because why is it necessary? We understand that we might suffer evil as a result of original sin, but animals don't have souls, they don't have freedom, and they aren't related to Adam and Eve, according to Augustine. So why do they suffer? And Augustine has two responses. He says they don't really suffer, they just appear to teach us about suffering, which is a pretty weak response in my view. So Augustine, animals don't really suffer, the appearance of suffering is to teach us. So we undo original sin and return to God through baptism, through accepting the sacraments and God's grace which comes through them. Pelagius said we had to be good to get back to God, but Augustine says no, that's not true. Otherwise, what justifies the death of Christ on the cross? Pelagius was declared a heretic by the Catholic Church, and we know this because the Catholic Church then is able to keep control of the sacraments and keep the keys of salvation. Okay, so here is a opening paragraph. You can pause this and feel free to read through this if you wish to. And then here are some criticisms. You can feel free to read through these if you wish to as well. So pause it. And then here is an essay, so feel free to pause it. Okay, so next we're going to look at John Hick's Irenaean Theodicy. So Augustine solves the inconsistent triad by denial that evil exists, or by really suggesting that evil is actually good because it's a necessary byproduct of God's benevolence. But Hick solves the problem of evil by suggesting that suffering isn't actually bad. Suffering is good. It allows us to develop and to soul make. Problems with this are why so much suffering. And Hick says there's so much suffering because there has to be epistemic distance. There needs to be so much suffering so that it's not obvious that God exists, so that the world appears as a cruel, God-free place, so that we have the freedom to choose to believe in God, the liberty of indifference, or the leap of faith. So suffering for Hick is a good thing, veil of soul-making. So this is the idea that what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. So suffering actually builds character, builds growth. And this is based on St. Irenaeus, who's a very early Christian thinker. And he develops this framework, this idea based on God's likeness. And Hick then jumps on this idea. So Hick was a professor of philosophy. He approached the issue from a broadly Christian perspective. And he presupposes the existence of Christian gods. So his Theodicy just explains God's existence, explains God's omnibenevolence rather than gives arguments for it. So for Hick, human life has a theocentric purpose. This means the purpose of our lives is to develop a close, loving relationship with God. Now, the only way to freely choose to believe in God is to have the freedom to not believe in God. This is called the liberty of indifference. So if I showed you my hand, you have to believe that I have a hand. I'm forcing you to believe that I have a hand. So there's no liberty of indifference there. There's no freedom to believe that I don't have a hand. You can't make yourself believe I don't have a hand because you've seen it. So the idea is God hides himself so that we have the freedom to choose to believe in him. So Hick rejects the Theodicy that has been the most popular since Augustine. Augustine's Theodicy maintains that evil and suffering exist because humans were made perfect but have free will, and therefore the ability to fall from grace and fall away from God. Hick says we're not falling away from God, instead we're developing towards God. So Hick believes in modern scientific accounts, in particular evolution, and the idea that we've never been made in a state of perfection. Instead, evolution shows that we are growing towards perfection. He also agrees that natural evil cannot be blamed on free will. It existed before humans. So Augustine, in Hick's view, reflects a pre-scientific worldview. And Hick relies on St. Irenaeus' understanding of Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, meaning we're made in God's image, but we're not perfect. We have to grow and develop into God's likeness. So Irenaeus says that history shows the development of humans to fulfill the likeness of God. We never fell from grace. We are chasing grace. So God has created us in his image with the potential to be and become fully in his likeness. and we should aim to develop as mankind more into God's likeness. And we can only do this through suffering. So for Augustine, we're created perfect by God and we fall. And for Augustine, a very pessimistic view of the world is getting worse all the time. Think of the fall of the Roman Empire. But Irenaeus, who was writing before Augustine, has a more positive view. The world is getting better. We are developing. So this is the twofold stage of creation. We're made in the image, but then we have to soul make and grow into God's likeness. And he also uses this passage from Corinthians. And we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another. So, twofold view of creation. In order for us to grow into a truly theocentric or loving relationship with God, there has to be epistemic distance. Epistemic means knowledge. In order for it to be a free choice that all can make and develop in, God must create mankind at a distance from himself. So epistemic distance, there has to be a knowledge gap that we must bridge between us and God. We grow into a more knowledgeable relationship through struggle and suffering. And there's more to it than this. God is omnibenevolent. So if God created a benevolent world, we would have complete knowledge of God. So God must make a world that doesn't reflect him. And that means there is epistemic distance. We can't see God in his creation. And therefore we can freely choose to believe in God despite this. So this is why God deliberately hides himself from us in this world. We wouldn't need to grow and develop and make a leap of faith through free choice if it was obvious. So therefore, the world is a place of evil, of suffering, that doesn't reflect God's nature. And this is known as religious ambiguity. So God deliberately hides himself to allow for religious ambiguity and the liberty of indifference and eventually our free choice. So feel free to pause this. This is a summary of what we've looked at so far. So this is the idea of veil of soul making then. Veil means a valley. So there must be evil in order for us to develop. In the same way as there must be mountains in order for there to be a valley. So is a good parent one that provides a child with a world full of pleasure and ease? No, that would be a spoilt child. The good parent is the one who provides obstacles and difficulties. It's the only way we grow. Could Malala be Malala without suffering? So this is the veil of soul making, and it's actually based on a poem by Keats. Or sorry, a passage by Keats. And Keats says this: I will that the world is a school instituted for the purpose of teaching little children to read. I will call the human heart the book used in that school, and I will call the child able to read. The soul made from that school and its book. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways? So in Romanticism, this is the idea that suffering and pain and melancholy isn't bad. It actually allows for growth, for development, for deeper spiritual truth. So Keats says, some say the world is a vale of tears. I say it's a vale or a place of soul making. So a quick summary of an opening paragraph for a Hick essay. So feel free to pause this if you wish to. Second paragraph for a Hick essay. Feel free to pause it. Okay, and then we have some criticisms. So first criticism, why does there have to be random, undeserved suffering? And Hick would say that's because of religious ambiguity. If everybody got what they deserved, there would be no need to help other people because we'd view it as deserved suffering. And that's what we actually see in the caste system, where there's karma in places like India. People actually don't help the poor because they think they deserve it. And similarly, it would be obvious that a just God exists if justice was issued out. Suffering has to be random so that there is religious ambiguity and therefore the liberty of indifference. Random suffering leads to religious ambiguity then. So this is the idea of it being indiscriminate. God sort of doesn't make sense. His nature isn't reflected in the world. And we see this even with Jesus. Jesus doubts God's goodness in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, so we have lots of strengths and weaknesses. So feel free to pause this and read through it. We have another criticism. Does there have to be quite such a harsh level of suffering? And the response here is that Hick believes God has made just enough suffering. Suffering is good as a warning system. Suffering is necessary for the balance of life. And also, if we complained about suffering and we asked for the next level down, all that would happen then is we would keep asking for less and less and less. Any amount of suffering then, it would turn out, would be too much. So for Augustine, moral evil only has a negative value. For Hick, it's a good thing. It has positive value. So moral evil actually is a positive thing, which is a way of solving the problem of evil. So this leads to a criticism. God has allowed the Holocaust then for soul making. How is that good? Who is it soul making for? It's not soul making for the 6 million who died. And if it is soul making for other people, how is it loving to use people in order to bring about a good consequence for others? This seems very utilitarian. So we might argue that Kant would disagree with this. Hick's answer is that suffering is ultimately a mystery. We have to rely on faith. And also he believes that soul making continues after death. Hick is a universalist, so he believes that all will eventually reach heaven, will reach salvation. And so we continue our existence and we continue to soul make. He also believes in this idea of eschatological justification, which means the end of time, everything will make sense. Okay, so we could argue that Hick is very utilitarian, which could be a criticism. But then we might argue that, you know, Christianity is quite utilitarian. One person dying so all can be saved. So we have the idea of eschatological justification then. From the point of view of future completion, Hick says, everything will make sense. We might say it presupposes an afterlife, which is a problem, but for Hick that's not a problem, because he's not trying to prove that God exists. He's just trying to demonstrate how God can exist at the same time as evil. Another criticism, if everyone is saved in the end, then what's the point in trying to be good? Well, the answer here is we might get there quicker if we're good. Now, do we earn salvation or do we get it through God's grace? Does suffering have to be quite as intense? Why do animals suffer? These are other problems that Hick's theory faces. Okay? Now, D.Z. Phillips actually argues that, and Aquinas argue that, well, perhaps language about God is univocal, which means it only means one thing. And therefore, how can we know God wants a love relationship with us? What actually does it mean for God to love us? If we understand love as the love we experience in this world, then what actually is God's love? That's quite a tricky criticism there. Do we understand God's love? Mary Midgley says that we shouldn't be focused on suffering being a good thing. Instead, we should be focusing on solving suffering. So Hick's theodicy doesn't work for that reason. Okay, so the best possible plan for a Hick essay is a tennis match going back and forth where you preempt what Hick's saying and look at his responses. And here's a Hick essay, so feel free to pause after each paragraph. Okay, thank you very much, Year 12.